nice to visually meet you.
It's true because we've only ever spoken on the phone, so it's nice to kind of like see each other in person. Well, as in person as we can be virtually.
Totally. So this is the official start to episode 9 of an Untold narrative. I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but basically I just ask a bunch of friends that I've met through the internet or the industry to come on and just kind of talk about, their creative background, what they do and things like that. So why don't you introduce yourself as best as you can?
Sure. So my name is Shasti Lowton, and I am a curator and art consultant. So I have my own independent practice, but then I also presently am working with the Design Museum, which is based in London.
That's incredible. And the Design Museum obviously has a very big name to it. I think it's like the largest like collection of museums, right? Or is that?
So the Design Museum is actually one of the youngest museums in the UK. So it was started kind of only about 30 years ago. And it began in the basement of the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is one of our largest museums here in the UK. And then because there wasn't a specific museum that was just dedicated to design at that point. It was all maybe art and design, or just sort of like contemporary art or historical art. And then from that kind of following, they moved to a site in Shad Thames, which is like the east of London, had a building there, became like quite successful. And then recently, so within the last, I think it was 2 years, 2 to 3 years ago, we moved to High Street, Kensington, and we're now based at the old Commonwealth Institute. So we've opened a dedicated museum for design in central London, which is really exciting.
It's amazing. Yeah. I mean, so that's pretty much how we got connected. But basically, I want to bring it all the way back because I think you're a very special guest for two reasons. One, you're our first international, like overseas. We've had somebody from Canada, but never overseas yet. So that's exciting. And then two, I think, the easy thing for people to understand is a lot of friends or connections that I have are through the footwear industry, right? So
Mhm.
this is a little bit different where it's completely different from what people I think would expect and like a guest to have. So I'm really excited to kind of hear about your history and kind of how you got into what you're doing because I have no idea. And I think it's something that's super rare, right? It's, how many art curators are there in the world? I don't know compared to like footwear designers, for example. But um, the first question I got is take us back to you grew up in the UK, it sounds like, and then how did you get into curation or art in general?
Okay, so yeah, I was born and brought up in London, but my family are from South Africa originally. So I spent a year living in South Africa from when I was 17 to 18. But the majority of my time has been spent in London. So basically, I think like most people in, well, I think like most teenagers around the world, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I didn't go to a really great high school. We call them secondary schools over here. And so I had like very, very limited career advice. Like I always used to get like decent grades. So like the career counselor, I had like I think one meeting with them, and they said, oh yeah, you got good grades, you can do whatever you want, but kind of like no real sort of guidance about how to make any of that happening. So when I was deciding to go to university, I did for my undergrad degree, I did a very open degree. So I did a joint degree in English literature, Spanish, and Latin American studies, because I've always liked languages. I've been very like blessed to be able to pick them up quite quickly. So while I was doing my undergrad degree, I got to spend a year abroad in Mexico,
Wow.
which amazing. You know, I was kind of supposed to be studying the history of Mexican art, but perhaps I just spent the year drinking tequila and eating tacos and dancing to salsa. Who knows? Who knows?
Doesn't sound too bad. If that's true, I'm not saying it is.
But yeah, so while I was there, I've always kind of really been into art, but because I didn't really know what the career options were for me at that point, because it was like when we were at school, we studied art, and it was like, okay, you either became a very famous artist or you became an art teacher. There was no sort of like explanation of the other career paths that are available for that subject choice. So then I graduated from my undergrad degree in the middle, smack bang in the middle of the recession.
Okay.
And I was just trying to get a job. So I tried everything. So I did a little bit of like journalism. I worked in fashion for a while. I did some PR. I worked in conference production for the oil and gas industry, which I do not recommend to anybody. So if you want to save your soul, do not go down that path. And like realistically, I just kind of hated all of it. And I was just thinking to myself, you know, if I'm gonna like kill myself, drag myself out of bed every morning, like make this happen, get ready, jump on a tube and commute to work, it needs to be for something that moves me. I've
Right.
always sort of loved art and museums, but like museums are a very opaque industry. So I think when you visit a museum, you go in and you see like our wonderful like front of house staff, like the visitor service assistants, and like the wonderful sort of commercial retail and cafe teams, but you don't get to know like what goes on behind the scenes, so how the whole thing is sort of put together.
Totally.
So I remember that like one day I was kind of like wandering around the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Ken, and I was like, okay, I want to work in a museum. What do I want to do in a museum? And then I decided, okay, I want to be the person that decides, okay, this painting goes here and that sculpture goes there. And I want to sort of design the exhibitions. So I was like, okay, let me work out what that is called. I figured out it was called a curator. And I
Right.
said, okay, what do I need to do in order to become a curator? So I very quickly figured out that most curators have postgraduate degrees. So I went back to university and I did a master's in creative and cultural industries at King's College London. And it was a particular degree strand where you could choose the creative industry that interested you most. So you could do all modules to do with music, or you could do all modules to do with arts management, or all modules to do with like theater. But like I was very much museums and galleries. So I did all the modules to do with museums and galleries. Then I started interning during my master's degree at a gallery in St. John's Wood in London. And then kind of been working in the industry ever since. So some
So
of it.
hold on. We got to
Okay.
back it up a little bit. That you cruised through like I don't know how many years, but a lot of years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's value in all of that. I mean, first and foremost, you touched on working in 4, 5, 6, 8 different industries before you
Yeah.
found what you liked, right? And you know, even today in 2020, there's definitely blends between art and fashion. You said you worked in fashion, but you didn't like it. So I think today somebody would be like, well, why didn't she just work in fashion if she already had that job? So like, was it just there's no love for that? It was like that wasn't you, or
No, I think it was about the type of job I had at that
okay,
point. So I've always been like a very creative person, and you know, I like to put things together. I like to make things happen. I mean, there's different types of curators, which I'm sure we'll go into in a little bit. But essentially, like, I'm an exhibition curator, which is similar to sort of being like a creative director, where you sort of you have like a topic or a theme, you define a narrative or a brief surrounding that theme, you develop a story, you pick the best objects, whether they're paintings, whether they're sculptures, or whether they're sneakers, which is obviously how we met because I was working on an exhibition about sneakers. And then you pick the item that tells the historical standpoint of that moment in time in the most visually impactful way, and you form it into a narrative that's really like accessible for the public. But then part of what you do as well is also kind of like communicate with 3D designers to design the exhibition build, so how the
Cool.
walls, everything are set up. You work with like a 2D graphic designer to decide like what fonts and what kind of labels you use, and then sometimes you work with interactive designers to create like really immersive experiences or work on commissions. So I think the job that I had in fashion, so I did like a couple of stints in retail, and then I worked as an emerging markets sales intern for Burberry. And it was just sort of more like numbers focused and more on sales,
Yeah.
which, I mean, like, they're great jobs and they're very relevant to the industry, but they just weren't for me. And I think perhaps if I had gone in with more of a creative job,
It
perhaps
would have been
I would have
different.
stayed in that industry. But
And you can, so you, I mean, you did a little bit of journalism, PR. I mean, those are fairly creative industries as well, though. I mean, but it sounds like that this, what you're describing is what you do today is more of a holistic process of working with a lot of different artists, really, or you know, really talented resources, and then bringing them all together. It sounds like
yeah.
even like writing or PR didn't do that for you.
Well, it's actually funny because I would say that the jobs that I had previously, the skills I developed from them are ones that I use like so much, and ones that are so relevant to being a curator. So for example, with journalism and PR, it's really important to know how to write, to make something like enticing, to make something accessible, to make something easily like to make a complex, I take a complex idea and make it something that people without a specialist knowledge can understand. And
Totally.
that's also what a curator does. So like when you go into a museum or a gallery, like we write all those little labels you see on the wall, so writing is a really important part of our job.
That's interesting. I always thought the artist wrote those.
So they can feed in, so it does depend. um, if you're working on a commission with, so you specifically commission a contemporary artist to produce a piece or specifically for a show, then sometimes you work with them to write the label or they feed in. But generally, if you're working for a museum or gallery, that museum or gallery has a specific tone of voice that you need to follow.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
That's really interesting. Well, that's, I mean, a lot of some past guests and hopefully future guests will resonate with this is that you really don't know what you want to do until you try a bunch of stuff and then you collectively put those together and then you build on them, right? So it sounds like that's exactly what happened. And so how you went to the master's in for King's College, was it? And
Mhm.
what year did you graduate that?
So it was a 1 year degree. So I started in 2012 and I graduated in 2013. And I was fortunate enough to secure a paid training placement at a museum in Coventry, which is about 1 hour and 10 minutes by train from London. And I
Okay,
think driving it's maybe about 2 hours away. And so I was working for the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum based out in Coventry as an exhibitions and collections trainee. And it really was that sort of position that cemented the fact that this was the sector that I wanted to be in.
yeah. What was that experience? So that's like a paid internship kind of placement, or like is it was a
Yeah,
real job, or
yeah. So it was. So they call it. We call it a traineeship here. So perhaps it's
like an
similar to.
apprenticeship?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
perhaps it's similar to an apprenticeship. So it was a 6 month placement, and it was funded by Arts Council England, which is one of our major funding bodies for the arts in the UK.
cool.
And it was specifically created to help people from non-traditional backgrounds, so BIPOCs and LGBTQ people kind of break into the museum and gallery sector.
Gotcha. That's awesome. And so you did the 6 months. It
Mhm.
went well, assumably. Like
Yeah.
what were what did you focus on in those 6 months? Like what specific tasks, right?
So it was actually kind of like during those 6 months that I put together the project that I still say I'm most proud of in my career.
That's
And
awesome.
it's really funny because it happened so early on. So I was working with a space called the Peace and Reconciliation Gallery in the museum. So Coventry is a city that has a big history regarding peace and reconciliation, because during World War II, the city was like destroyed by bombs. And if you walk around it today, it's like really beautiful because you can still see like the ruins of the old cathedral, like mixed in with like the new builds that have like sprung up around the city. And when this happened, I believe they're called the deacon of the cathedral. I'm not Catholic, so I'm not quite up to speed on the different sort of like levels of priesthood within the Catholic Church. But he he kind of had this like really great sort of like speech to the people of Coventry and said to them that, you know, in times like this, it's more important to forgive rather than retaliate. So that's why Coventry has this history of being a city of peace and reconciliation. So the museum honors that with a peace and reconciliation gallery where they kind of tell the story of the history of Coventry, how they sort of rose up like a phoenix from the ashes after this bombing. And then within that, there's also a temporary exhibition space where we tell tales of contemporary conflict. So when I was working there, it coincided with the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And I got the chance to put a display together from scratch. And it was kind of the first time I'd ever done this, like in my life. So I would just sort of went in like full guns blazing. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this really great. And, you know, to this day, it even just amazes me. I had like the most minimal budget. So my budget for the whole thing was £2,000, which is like absolutely nothing to sort of
Doesn't
put a
sound like
show
a
or anything.
lot.
But I managed to convince like really like profound and amazing and award-winning contemporary artists like Alfredo Jar and Jonathan Togovnik to lend us work for the exhibition. So I was put this show together, and it was very well received by the public and the community. And it told the story of like how using contemporary art, it told the story of how the genocide like transpired, specifically focusing on the fact that sexual violence was one of the major weapons of warfare that was used during that period. And I think after the exhibition went up, a UN ambassador came to the museum for another event and then went to see and just happened to go and see the show. And then afterwards, he got in touch with me and asked for my research regarding putting the show together, like the statistics and everything like that. Specifically around like the subject of sexual violence in warfare, which is something that still kind of goes on today. So that was really, really amazing. Not because of like, oh, okay, the show got so much press or you know, it really like made a huge splash on the creative scene, but it really did show me that museums and exhibitions have the potential to change lives, because this is somebody that's in a position to influence policy that was moved by a show that, you know, I put together as part of my work placement,
Right.
and hopefully has taken that away to affect policy at a higher level and change the lives of women who are surviving in conflict zones.
That's incredible. So I mean, just on that alone, I like have like two like questions like floating in
Okay.
my brain, right? So the first is like, okay, you have £2,000 to work on this. What is the space, right? And then also like when you say that you ask and you reach out to artists for work, does their art have to be directly tied to your mission and what your goals are? And then how do you convince them to do all that, right? How did you, is it as simple, it sounds like it was early back in 2014, 15 ish. And like, do you just slide into their DMs on Instagram? Like, how do you reach out to artists and convince them to just lend you work?
So
And then
when you
what was the space about, like what were you given? Like, what was your platform?
so okay, lots of questions in
Yeah,
one.
sorry.
Sorry. Um, so when you're given sort of a subject to produce an exhibition on, and it's you have to have like a period of research to really sort of understand the historical importance of what transpired, or all the different levels and elements and players that sort of go into making that story what it is today. Because realistically, as a curator, you are a storyteller, and by putting something into a museum exhibition, or even if you acquisition, which is purchase something for a museum collection, you're sending a message out to the wider public that this is something that's historically important, or
Right.
this is something that has historical relevance. So it's not a decision that so these aren't decisions that you can make lightly without doing sort of like a lot of the background reading and a lot of the background research. So you have to really know your subject matter first off. And it's even more important when you're curating these shows or telling these stories that are about, like, very sensitive themes,
Emotional, like subject matters. Yeah.
sensitive emotional themes like war and conflict. So that was the first thing that that's the first thing that you have to do.
Even I had no idea like how research heavy it was, right? I mean, and it totally makes sense that somebody can call you up being like, this isn't true. And if it's like, it can destroy the whole platform if you don't do all that legwork. And that's something hopefully other people can get insight into, because I had no idea. That's why I asked the question. I'm like, I don't know anything about this. And that's amazing that you have to do all that.
Yeah, so most museum shows, a curator starts working on them between 2 and 5 years before they open to the public. So something like the huge costume institute shows at the Met in New York,
Yeah.
they will be working on those 5 years before they open to the public. So they program 5 years in advance. I mean, like,
Holy cow.
it doesn't always happen in your career. So like, I have worked on shows where I've had a 6 month lead time, and that's
The world's
completely
moving
crazy.
fast. Yeah.
Yeah,
5 years is like a lifetime.
but like generally most museum shows, you have at least the 2 year lead time before it opens to the public.
Holy cow.
So that's kind of how you sort of structure your time. So I would say after you kind of do that initial really crucial period of research, it's also then that you sort of start to identify potential artists, potential collectors, potential sort of like designers who has existing work that sort of already feed into the story. And yeah, I mean, quite often it's just sort of emailing their studio, emailing
Yeah.
them, emailing their galleries. It's like, when I was working on sneakers, I was sliding into a lot of people's DMs, and it was really strange, because it's like, yeah, I don't want people to get the wrong idea, because you have this idea, oh, you're sliding to someone's DMs, it's
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you're
totally.
sending them like heart eye emojis or something. But like, now I'm just really glad that the world is changing in that sense, that people are sort of more accessible, so you
Yeah.
can get in contact with them in different ways. And
But,
it's
but
really,
but then like when you're working on this, right, and you're emailing the studios, and obviously that's still a form of communication today. You can do that. But how do you how do you find these artists who resonate in that period of time of the story you're building, right? Is there like a database of like artists that you like search through? Like how do you find, because you named off 2 or 3 artists earlier, and I'm
yeah.
like, I have no idea who that is.
So I mean, like, you find them through different sources. So it's like, when you're researching, you use a variety of sources. So obviously, like, Google is amazing. Google, Google,
It's a
Google,
good
Google
one.
us so much in our life and in our world. So you can find a lot through if you're searching for specific scholarly articles, or like, even just sort of like, articles from like sites like the Art Newspaper or like Freeze. You get to sort of like learn about a lot of work through like just kind of doing basic internet searching as well. But for something that's sort of more historic, you can go to like archives and libraries, and then, I
Yep.
think it's quite rare that you come across a subject that hasn't been touched on at least like once or twice before.
I gotcha.
Also, I would say that, like, if this is something that you choose to do, it's really important to just go out and keep on seeing work. So like, part of what I have to do is just stay up to date on new artists. So I go to like lots of art fairs, lots of biennales, lots of like shows, and not just shows at like big museums and galleries and like well-known institutions, but also some that are kind of like more underground, because
Totally.
that's the exciting part as
That's
well.
the
It's,
real stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
finding that up and coming on emerging artists and being able to support them in developing their career as
That's
well.
what I, that's totally why I even do this podcast and YouTube, is like bringing people who don't have a following, who haven't built a business that's millions of dollars, who are literally on the ground floor, but they're super talented, and like they create, their own personal brand within a space that they're not like shouting to the world. I guess it's just like, I'm tired of listening to podcasts where they only have the people who have made it. And there's a space for that, right? And I gain a lot of knowledge from it, but like, you can't ignore the people who are on the ground floor putting in all the work. So like, totally 1000%, I love like the underground, like the person who's grinding away to get there, right? I think that's the fun part.
Yeah, I mean, in this day and age, I have to say that I do connect with a lot of artists through Instagram as well. It's my personal choice to kind of have mine as more of a private account, because I like to sort of maintain a level of like privacy in my life.
Yeah,
And, maybe one day I will have a public Instagram that, you know, can amass those followers. But at the moment, it's not what's important to me.
totally.
But yeah, but like definitely, like I've like through social media has been such a game changer over the past couple of years. It's like through like being on like Twitter chats, or just sort of like scrolling through Instagram, and like, seeing like, you're using your explore page. I've connected with like artists and like other curators and institutions that like I've collaborated with, that like I brought in to like be in shows, and vice versa. So I mean, it's definitely, there is that place for social media within this, but like it's not the only like avenue in order to kind of get yourself out there.
1000%. And you mentioned even doing research in libraries. I mean, I know generally who watches these videos, and like, ain't none of us going to a library and doing research.
But like, I'm surprised because obviously, because I know like, we've had discussions about the work that you do for Vibram, and it's like, for me, it's just like when you're starting for like to put together like a new like design portfolio, or a new sort of like working on a new product or whatever, it just seems natural to kind of look back to what's been done before. So that would be like either in like your company archive, or
Totally.
maybe a like design library or something like that. It just seems so logical to me to kind of like look backwards to see what's been done, what worked, what didn't work, and like maybe think about how we can change that moving forward.
Yeah, for me, it's not logical. I don't. I obviously like the design archive for Vibram specifically. Yes, 1000%, because it like directly impacts and influences what I do and the work that I work with for different brands. But like, when, I don't know if libraries are open again or not, but I'm gonna go to a library and start researching stuff. I think that's such an underutilized platform that's gonna, stand the test of time. I don't think they're going anywhere, right? So it's like, I think it's really interesting. It's a perspective that I lost sight of. I mean, I haven't gone to the library since like at least in 10 years.
Yeah, I always say the best kind of creative breakthroughs start with you freezing to death in a library. that's
Oh.
how that's what I've always sort of experienced, because it's like here the libraries are like super cold, so I'm like always with my hoodie, my scarf, some like gloves. I think like with some of the like rarer types of books or the older books, they have to keep things at a certain temperature for preservation reasons, so it's like
Gotcha.
I'm normally there freezing to death in like the National Art Library or some room in the British Library, like looking through like material.
Amazing.
And that's when like the major creative breakthroughs happen.
That's awesome. So you do this 6 month apprenticeship. You have this successful show, this story, this narrative that you told. What happens next for you?
Well, then actually, there was there like there was, I would say, an ebb. There was an ebb in my career, because there's lots of ebbs and flows as you kind of go through within the creative industry. So I came off this exhibition and I realized what I wanted to do, and it was amazing. And then like I moved back to London, and I was looking for like a curatorial role in London, and I was really struggling. I was struggling to find something even at like entry level, because it's just so competitive. I think like most creative industries, it's so competitive, and you know sometimes there is a lot of nepotism. You're competing against people that went to the best schools, that went to the best like universities, that whose family are like on the board of trustees. It's not always very easy to break in.
Yeah.
But so I just kind of like kept on trying, and then i also I'm the type of person where I don't believe that you should always wait for somebody to give you an opportunity. I think that if you want to do something, you should just sort of like do it yourself, right? You should make that space, make that table for you to have that seat at. So I got back in touch with the museum in Coventry, and I said, listen, I know that, budgets are tight, and, perhaps you can't pay me, but I would really like to put another show together for the space. Is that something that we can make happen? So they said yes. So I started working on another show for the Peace and Reconciliation Gallery. This one was looking at a specific peace and reconciliation technique that's used in zones of warfare, like after warfare. So when like people like the UN come in afterwards to kind of get the country to a stable level.
Mm-hmm.
And then so I was doing that, and then yeah, I was looking for paid work. I did a stint as a front of house visitor service assistant in the British Museum, and all the while sort of applying for other things. Then eventually I got another sort of like, it was a 1 year training contract this time, but it was with the National Trust. So the National Trust, they own like the majority of our historic houses and heritage sites here in the UK. So like things like the old sort of like mansions, like great open park spaces, some of the like historic sites, they own the majority of them. And it was working for a historic house that's based in Richmond called Ham House and Gardens. And I was brought in to kind of define their archive and engagement strategy. So they didn't have an archive at the time. It was like just this room, like full of boxes with
Oh
loads
my
and loads
God.
of, yeah, loads and loads of boxes, like full of like papers and everything about like the house's history, and other things pertaining to not only the formation of the trust, but the families that lived in the building and everything previously. So so I worked on that, and I put together that archive space for them, and worked on a couple of other projects during that time. And then alongside doing the show for the Herbert, the other show for the Herbert. And then when that contract came to an end, I decided to sort of like start my own freelance practice. So
What
then
year is this, by the way?
this is like 2015. Oh, I came into museum and galleries like quite late in my life. So I was, I think, 27 when I decided what I wanted to do with my life.
It's all right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with my life.
Yeah. I think even now I'm still kind of figuring it out, you know,
Totally.
because it's like, yeah, but at that point, so yeah, it was 2015 and my contract with the National Trust was coming to an end. Because it was a training contract, there wasn't the possibility for them renewing me. But then also, I knew that I wanted to be more in a contemporary space, like a contemporary museum or contemporary
Right.
gallery. So I started doing some freelance work. I picked up some really good sort of freelance positions. So
But
sorry, I'm going back now because it's 7 years that I've been in the sector, so I have to sort of rewind a
yeah,
little
yeah,
bit.
yeah. But like when you say freelance, that's when I think of freelance, or you think of freelance graphic design, you think of freelance footwear design, you think of what is freelance curation or story, like what is entitled in that position, like what?
So it's either so it can work in two ways, or for me, it's worked in two ways. Perhaps it also works in more for other people, but it's either you have an idea and you put a show together and then you pitch it to an organization to see whether they're interested in putting it on. So that's one way that it can
And
happen.
you go against other bids, right? Or other
Um,
people.
Sometimes it depends how you pitch it. It's like if you have connections at that organization. So I did like a pop up exhibition at the South Bank Centre, which is sort of like a multidisciplinary arts venue here in London. So they have like, so they do exhibitions, they do dance performances, they do theatre, they kind of like do it all. It's like a really great, really exciting space. And but they like to use a model which they call the festival model because that's how the center was started. So they do like cool festivals that last for between a week and a weekend. Like for example, they have one called Women of the World, and that's, I think, has since been sort of picked up by other places around the world, and it's sort of a festival where it has like exhibitions, public program events, like, you know, performances that like feed into this theme of Women of the World. So alongside Women of the World, they have a festival called BAM, which is Being a Man Festival. And at this point, I was sort of working on a project called the Fatherhood Project that I had conceived here, which was to give a platform to Black fathers in the UK to kind of like negate that stereotype that they're not involved in their kids' lives. So
Sure.
I wanted to kind of put this project together and give Black fathers like from London a platform to sort of like just share their experiences of fatherhood and what's so special about it for them,
That's
what
awesome.
they find so difficult. And so I had that idea, and I knew that South Bank Centre had the Being a Man Festival, and at the time, I knew one of the main programmers there, so I just sent her an email and said, "Hey, I'm working on this project. I think it'd be great for Being a Man Festival. Like, what do you think?" And she was like, "Yeah, let's make it happen." So we made it happen. So that was quite cool. But then other ways that you can do freelance work is quite often like because budgets are quite tight in museums and galleries, and sometimes they need like an additional person to come in to sort of help see a project through. They advertise for like a short-term curator or a
Gotcha.
short-term project manager to kind of like help see a project through to fruition. So it's also applying for things like that.
Cool. Those are both totally different ways of working.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. So how long did you freelance for?
I'm still freelancing. I do
Oh,
it. I
okay.
do it alongside what I do. So because it's when you work with an institution, I mean, you do get amazing opportunities and the resources are completely different, but you don't always get the chance to do those passion projects or those projects that move you. Whereas like from a freelance capacity, you can be a little bit more choosy about
Totally.
what you take on. So
That's awesome. So you found the best of both worlds.
yeah, for now.
No. So a couple questions is like, one, how did you start your relationship with the design museum? And then two, I really got to understand how you started your relationship with D, who's our mutual
Okay,
connection, because like we got to
sure.
bring it full circle. And I have asked him to be on this as well. I've just been
Oh, amazing.
he's
Okay.
going to be on in a few episodes, hopefully down the road. So obviously he has a tremendous story himself. But those are like, when did that relationship with Design Museum start? Kind of what is that capacity? And then, we can maybe talk about D afterwards.
Sure. So I came to the Design Museum, it was July 2018.
Okay.
And I was initially brought on to curate their Designers in Residence program. So every year, the museum sets a theme, and then we do an open call inviting designers around the world to apply to be in residence at the museum for a year.
Seriously?
Yep,
Sounds awesome.
it is pretty awesome. And so after the most like intense and difficult shortlisting process known to man, because you can imagine we get some like really really amazing sort of like proposals and applications and everything, and like there's just so many talented designers out there.
It's
We
tough.
have we're only allowed to select 4 each year, which
Holy
is
cow.
really hard. But yeah, so then we select 4 and we invite them to be in residence in the museum. So my role for that particular project was working quite closely with them, so in a sort of a mentoring capacity as well, to help sort of like shape and give them the tools to elevate their practice to the next level and work on, it can be 1 or more commissions for the museum to be realized during that year. And it takes the form of an exhibition showcase, a publication. Sometimes we have a short film festival as well, and then public program feeds into it quite a lot. So these days, like the intersection between design and art, like it's
Totally.
like you can't tell the difference anymore. It's just blurring. It's really lovely because it's like one discipline is feeding into the other, and then the other one is taking something from that, and like they're like growing and blossoming together and like intertwining, and it's super exciting. But oh, I lost my point now. Sorry, this
No,
happens sometimes.
so July 2018, you started working with them
Yeah,
in that capacity.
yeah, and yeah, so we did design. I did designers in residence. Really great. It was really like exciting. And but then I also kind of was working with the larger curatorial team, sort of feeding into like contemporary exhibitions that we were planning for the up and coming program. And then the idea of this show for sneakers came up, and I was just like, okay, I want this show, I'm going to curate this show, everybody can go home now because you're just going to give it to me, so we might as well just
I love that.
we might as well just like stop the back and forth, and
But
you can
did,
just
did
quit.
you have a love of sneak? Like, where did, why was this such a passion thing for you?
Do you know what it is? Like, I guess it was for a couple of reasons that I wanted to work on this show. So first of all, I thought like the sneaker is a really sort of democratic entry point to design, because I mean everybody around the world has a pair of sneakers, and it's like it's an object that I think everybody can relate to, and it allows you to sort of delve into the different sort of layers of design. And like as well as I do, that sneakers, they kind of sit on like this nexus of like product, fashion, like industrial design, like technical design, and then also now like the speculative design, because we have things like you know breathing shoes that are fused with biodesign, and like shoes that purify air when you walk. So it's like it's an incredible industry, and it's sort of one that's setting the pace for some other sectors as well. So like in that point, I thought it was a really nice way to introduce people that perhaps didn't have like this background knowledge of design, or didn't have, maybe even didn't even know that they had an interest in the other areas of design, and just show them the different routes that are possible using this one object that everybody can relate to.
Right.
And I think secondly, so museums around the world, like they're quite whitewashed when it comes to the curatorial staff and programming. So, for example, within the UK, only I think 7% of staff working in museums are BIPOC, and of that 7%, only 1.8% work in curatorial roles. So this, like, so when we think about sneakers and how sneakers sort of like grew from like this apparatus for sport into like the cultural phenomenon that it is today,
Yeah.
it's like you can't ignore
Totally.
the influence that the Black, Brown, Latinx community have had in making this happen.
1000%.
And I felt it was really important to have a curator that identified with that background to sort of bring these stories of these like amazing, like, you know, these amazing icons, these amazing designers, these like, you know, amazing sort of like people that like were figures in the community, that are figures in the sneaker community, to the forefront. And that's another reason why I wanted to do it, because it's like, you know, I thought if we're going to do this, we need to do this in the right way and give the respect and the homage where it deserves to be.
That's awesome. So what year did, like you talked about 2 to 5 years, what year, like what time frame did this idea or the conception of the idea, like when did it start?
So I remember the conversation first being brought into our curatorial meetings. It was February last year,
19.
but there were some other sort of like logistical specifics that needed to get in place in regards to like, you know, funding and resource and everything. So I ended up only being handed the project in September of last year.
Oh my God.
And we were due to have, as you know, a May 5th opening date, but obviously COVID has postponed things. So we're still working the kinks out of when the new opening date will be. But yeah, that was the project that, yeah, I was supposed to deliver in 6 months.
So that was a 6-month project.
It was supposed to be a 6-month project, yeah.
I remember when we first started, you're like, we're on an extremely tight timeline.
Just gonna let you know, extremely tight.
So how did you find Dee then?
So as part of sort of the team, I recruited like 2 amazing volunteers that worked as curatorial research assistants with me on the project. So one of them, Naomi, absolutely amazing. You're probably going to be interviewing her on this podcast one day.
Okay.
So
What's her last name?
Naomi, her name is Naomi Zaragoza.
Okay, you could send me a link. I'm not going to remember. I don't know how to write that down.
Yeah, I'll have to let her know that I shouted her out on this podcast too.
Totally.
But yeah, so she came across, I think it was an article or an Instagram account for the Sneaker Museum in Boston, which is obviously like run by Dee and Rick, because it basically showcases Rick's amazing collection of Jordan everything. And they have like, he has like the most amazing sort of collections, not just of sneakers, but also like of like, there's like Jordan jackets and like, you know, like sporting equipment and everything. There's like the little dolls, and it's just like the most amazing space with the most amazing archive. So she found like an article or Instagram like for the Sneaker Museum in Boston, and then passed on the email address. And then like I think I emailed and D responded. I think maybe it was Rick or D responded at first. And then I was kind of busy with other things. So, because, I had 6 months to put a show together.
Totally.
So I think eventually we managed to connect again. And, obviously I found out the museum was based in Boston, and I was flying to Boston to meet with Converse and see their archive to choose pieces for the
Which is
museum,
cool.
which
Theirs is
is
awesome.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So,
awesome.
like I said to Dee, oh, I'm gonna be in Boston. Like, why don't we like meet up while I'm there? So then, yeah, we met in Boston, and yeah, we just kind of like clicked, and because he is good people and
He's
he's amazing.
awesome. He knows a lot of people too.
Yeah, he's amazing and so inspiring, and yeah, we got on really well, and then we connected, and obviously hopefully once things settle down they'll still be one of the lenders for the exhibit, for the sneakers exhibition when it opens. But yeah, we've also kind of become friends from that initial sort of conversation, so it's really
That's
nice.
awesome. Yeah, no, D's one of those people that like you meet him once and you're like, okay, I know this guy. He's got my back for the rest of my life.
Mhm.
There's no question about it. And yeah, it was weird because I met him through a friend of a friend that was introduced. We were having coffee, and then he's like, "Oh, have you heard of this guy D?" And I'm like, "No." He's like the sneaker guy. Like, you got to reach out, and we live in the same city. And he's like, just send him a message. So that's how we connected. And then yeah, that's incredible. And so I'm assuming that you just like you guys were chatting about what you're trying to accomplish, and he's like, I know this person, this person, this person, this person.
Yeah, it was just I mean, because I suppose as well as anybody that like the sneaker community and the sneaker design industry, it's like it's small, it's like everybody knows each other. So it was, for me, it was such a blessing to meet someone like D, who was so open to sharing not only his knowledge but his contacts, and and his pieces with us. And that was just amazing. And I think it's really funny because I always say that working on this exhibition, it's been like getting a crash course in the sneaker industry, because it's like, one, like as a sneaker fan, it's like, you don't know very much about the industry, but then it's like when you sort of delve into it and you get to grips with how it actually like maneuvers and works and runs, it's like, it's crazy. It's like your mind is just blown.
And it's ever changing, right? I mean, more so today than ever. I mean, it is moving way faster than anybody ever anticipated. It's really hard to stay ahead of the curve. But yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I'm like super excited. I really hope in the future, obviously maybe it even isn't, I don't know, late 2020 or 21. I was excited to hopefully plan a trip out and go see the museum when it came to fruition, because I think it's going to become a staple for people to go visit and kind of get themselves educated on it if they're interested. Which I think you can reach more people outside of the fashion, the sneakerheads, the reach the everyday person who is part of it and doesn't even know they're part of it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it's like that was one of my ambitions with the show, is to be able to like sort of inspire the next design generation. So maybe it's the school kids that come to the show that have never thought about being a sneaker designer, or never knew that there were so many different like entry points into this career, and making that like more visible and more accessible to them. So we also we have this fabulous partnership with Pencil Academy, that's part of
So do
that's
we.
part of the
So does
show.
Vibram.
Yeah, amazing. I love Dwayne and the guys from
Yeah, yeah,
Pencil.
yeah.
Like he's another great. You should get him on this podcast as well, because
So
he's
Chris Dixon's going to be on it.
okay.
I don't know if you met Chris. He's
I
one of
haven't met
he's one of
Chris.
the designers. Yeah,
Okay.
he's a great human as well. I'm excited. He's gonna follow your episode probably.
All exciting. Yeah. So I mean, for me, that's what I want the most from the shows that I put together, is to inspire the public, and the public reaction is what I find like most satisfying and most special. So I did this exhibition for the Science Museum, and it was called Illuminating India. So it was a historical survey of photography in India from 1857 right up to 2017.
Okay.
And yeah, no, it was an amazing show to work on. But like, I think the best bit of the whole experience, you know, I mean, I got to do some amazing things and meet some amazing people. I got to like fly to India and like meet with like private collectors and pick pieces from the show. I was having cocktails in rooftop bars in Delhi.
So
Like, it
cool.
was like, it was a really amazing experience. But the thing that made it the most sort of worthwhile for me was when the exhibition opened, like a member of the public sent an email to the museum and said like, thank you so much for putting this show together. It was the history lesson on my culture that I never knew I needed. And
Oh,
something
I
like
just got
that,
chills. That
just
was crazy.
it's just like something like that. It's just so special, and
Oh
you take that
yeah,
away with you. And I think like that's all, like, honestly, I think that's all any curator sort of like really wants from what
totally.
they put together. They just want, they want to do something that inspires somebody, whether like, you know, my work inspires you to pick up a camera and, you know, like dabble in photography, whether it inspires you to like, you know, forge a career in museums, whether it just like inspires you to learn more about a particular time period, culture or history or person. That's like my end game. My end game is just to make knowledge more accessible to everybody.
Well, that's going to be the perfect clip. I can't wait to clip that. That was awesome. What a rocket ship of a statement. No, that's really beautiful. Honestly, like the last question I have, probably, we've been chatting for an hour, believe it or not, already. So, what's next for the future for you, right? Like, what is, you just talked about your main mission is to just inspire others and create this, knowledge base for people to help grow as humans themselves. And like totally that's very similar to what I'm trying to do. But like what do you think is like the next big thing, for you? Do you think about a 5-10 year plan? I mean, some people do, some people don't. I personally don't. I think that's too far away, but
I have done, but I'm not like, I have sort of, I suppose, what could be an ultimate aim, but how I get there, I'm still figuring that out. So, as I mentioned before, like my family is South African originally, and I would really love to move back to South Africa one day to open an art center there. Um,
awesome.
so like basically, like, I'm going to give you a little bit of like back history. We might go over the hour, and I'm
Oh,
sorry,
it's
but
totally
like
fine.
you can like cut it out, or
Oh, no,
you
no,
know.
no, totally fine.
Okay. So my mom was born in India, around like the year before partition happened. So that was when India split into India and Pakistan, and there was like a great deal of conflict and violence between Hindus and Muslims at that period. So like the events that sort of transpired during that time frame, it made her family terrified. So they left everything. So they left their house, left everything. They took 2 suitcases because it was all they were able to sort of bring with them, and they got on a ship where they weren't allowed above deck because they weren't white. And then they traveled from India to South Africa,
Yeah.
and then they settled in South Africa. My dad's family, so his family came to South Africa from India in the 1800s through indentured labor, and then they settled in South Africa. So my mom and dad met in South Africa, fell in love, but my dad was quite involved with the ANC party. So he had to, so ANC, that the African National Congress, who were involved in the fight against apartheid. So he had to either leave the country or he was going to be thrown into prison. So then him and my mom, again, left everything, traveled to the UK in the 60s, settled here in London where they had me and my sisters. And we've gone back on like vacations and stuff, and obviously like I lived there, but I do see that even though the way that it happened was like horrific, them coming here allowed me to have a lot of opportunities that wouldn't be available back in South Africa because of the color of my skin and because of the fact that I'm a woman. So I wanted to, like, what I would want to do is take all these skills and knowledge that I've built up and learned here, take it back home, open an art center, like multidisciplinary. So that follows the model of a center called the Roundhouse here in the UK. So what it is, there'll be an exhibition space, there'll be like a performing arts space, there'll be like music studios, painting studios, everything there. And like kids from like 15 to right up until 35, they can apply for like scholarships and memberships to come in and use the facilities, put together their own program, and just sort of start like a real, like, I suppose, center of opportunity for them to define their own creative path. Obviously, I'm going to need like a lot of money, a lot of funders for that. So anybody watching this that wants to give me money to start an institute in South Africa, you know, David has my contact. Get in touch. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the ultimate aim. And the idea is people that are involved in the membership program or like that have like these funded bursaries, they'll also kind of like help shape arts education for other people coming up, like within the country.
That's tremendous.
So that's kind of the ultimate aim. Whether it happens or not, we'll see. But I think it's
You
nice.
can't even put a time frame on something like that. Like so many things have to click together. Obviously, it's a long road, but that's truly amazing. Keep in mind, I mean, who knows, in 5, 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is, I'd be more than happy to donate to it. I think that's awesome. I'm a big fan of people trying to improve society, humanity, cultures, things like that. So that's awesome. That's a really good goal.
Yeah, I think it's given because when I go home and like I talk to like my nieces and nephews and like my baby cousins and stuff, and it's like the education system in South Africa is still so Eurocentric. It's so funny. It's like like they don't really learn about African history in schools, and it's like the arts education, it's so Eurocentric. It's like it's not really sort of like embracing the amazing history that like South Africa and the rest of the continent has had in shaping the contemporary art scene as we know it today. So it's also kind of given them a chance to create their own education system, like giving like actual people from Africa, like people that are involved in these industries, that are involved in this line of work, like giving them the chance to sort of shape their own syllabus for the future. So I think that would be quite exciting.
That's awesome. I'm excited for you. With that, do you have like a website? Obviously, your Instagram's private. Obviously, I could see because we're connected on there. But
Yeah.
you have like a website or a way that people can reach you or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, so my website is www.shastilowton.com. So that's Shasti Lowton,
I'll plug it down there.
LOWTON.com. But then, I mean, I do accept like follow requests on like Instagram, and my Twitter is public. I don't use it that much because, yeah, some of like the stuff that people are tweeting nowadays, like all the transphobic and racist and misogynist remarks, it just
It's a
really
lot.
it's a lot. So I tend to stay off Twitter, and I'm more like an Instagram person. But you can follow me at Curate Movements as well.
We'll
Yeah.
plug it in there for people, and then you can choose who you accept. But
Yeah.
no, I mean, this isn't like a massive platform yet. But I think the people that we've had so far and that, you know, watch these are really like good, passionate people about making a difference. And I truly believe that everybody who I can try to get on here is going to make a difference. And that's, to me, that's the goal, right? So if you get requests, it's probably from really good people. So That's exciting. Well, thank you for the time on Sunday. I know that it's in the evening now in the UK, but
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's honestly been a pleasure.
yeah, this is so much fun. I'm so happy we got to meet and kind of learn a little bit about your history. And I'm sure that we'll eventually at some point connect in real life, which I'm really excited about, and getting over to the Design Museum, which will definitely happen.
Amazing. Okay, well, take care, David.
Thanks so much.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.